Let's look at the German verb haben. This is, of course, the infinitive form of the verb. That means its base or dictionary form, which ends in en, and we could translate it into English as have. But often we do also have a to before the infinitive form to indicate that it's not in one of its conjugated forms with an ending. Speaking of endings, let's put endings on this verb. We need to go through a process of conjugation, putting on endings according to these 6 different people. And we'll start with the present tense. And I'm just going to put the regular endings that you would expect on a regular verb in German, and we'll see what happens. E, st, t, en, t, en. This is so close to being correct. The only thing that's happened is, over time, the du and the er, sie, es forms have changed slightly. We're lucky in German that the plural forms pretty much never change. They're never irregular. We can always expect these 3 endings after we've chopped off the en. But the du and the er, sie, es forms do change sometimes. And over time, because this is such a common verb, the B has been lost in these forms. So we just say, ich habe, I have, du hast, you have, er, sie, es hat, he, she, it has. Wir haben, we have, ihr habt, you plural have, and sie haben, they have, or you formal have. Now let's look at the simple past tense. This is not the most common past tense in German. We'll get to that next. But this is important, particularly with this verb, and it is hatte. We're going to use the form because that gives us all the information we need. And this is an important form by itself, but also it's used for the pluperfect form, the pluperfect tense, which is where you say had played, for example. So it's the past tense before past tense. And this hatte is important because it is used for that had. The perfect past tense is the most common past tense in German. Let's have a look at it. Hat gehabt. And a funny thing here is, you'll notice, we've got 2 forms of haben. We've got hat hier, which is the helping verb for haben, i.e. gehabt, in its past participle form. So he has had. The future tense is very normal. We say wird haben. As always, we simply get the correct form of werden, and then it sort of acts like a modal verb because we send the second verb to the end of the sentence with an en and no zu before it. Finally, a couple of idioms. We use the verb haben sometimes when we don't in English, and they're the ones I'm going to focus on. We say, for example, in German, Hunger haben, and also Durst haben. And these 2 phrases mean to be hungry and to be thirsty, but German uses haben where we don't in English. Another really important one is Recht haben, to have right, which you might be able to guess means to be right. Of course, the opposite is used as well with haben, and that's Unrecht haben. Let's do some conjugation practice. And you might like to pause the video here and see whether you can do all 10 of these sentences by filling in the correct form of haben in the gaps and translating into English. We have, first of all, ich habe freitags Deutsch. I have German on Fridays. We've got an E ending on habe, and that's because it comes from the subject ich. Ich is in charge of it. I. One interesting thing to note about this sentence is that the time phrase comes before the object, which German often likes to do. And sometimes we call that the when before what rule. The second sentence, sie hat nur eine Schwester. She only has one sister. In this case, again, we've got an ending, the T, which comes from the subject in charge of the verb, which is sie or she. Number 3, hast du immer Hunger? Are you always hungry? Notice the idiom. It's literally, have you always hunger? We've got an ST ending, which is linked to the du, but what I want to focus on in this example is the fact that the verb is first. And that's because it's a question, and in closed questions, you always start with the verb, both in English and in German. What might confuse you if you're translating from English is that there's no do. Even if you know that it's have hunger, in English we'd say, do you have hunger? But that do, which sort of just exists as a sort of helping verb in questions and also in negative statements, doesn't exist in German. So we're just going to start with the have. Number 4, meine Eltern haben 2 Katzen. My parents have 2 cats. We've got the en ending, which is linked to our plural third person subject. In other words, meine Eltern could be replaced by sie in our conjugation table, they. Number 5, am Wochenende hat Schwein gehabt. Here we had to fill 2 gaps, and we were looking for the perfect tense. We've got hat in its present tense form, and that is, of course, linked to as the subject. But really, that's just a helping verb for gehabt, which is the verb have here, with the actual meaning of have. And it means, on the weekend, he was dead lucky. This is simply an idiom for having luck in German. Number 6, du musst einen Personalausweis haben. You have to have a personal identity card. In this case, we've got haben in the infinitive form at the end of the sentence. Why is that? Well, it's because we have a modal verb as the first verb, and the modal verb always sends the next verb to the end of the sentence with an en ending and no zu. Number 7, in meiner Kindheit hatte ich einige Schwierigkeiten. This time we have a simple past tense form of the verb. There was only one gap, and it was definitely the past tense because this person is reminiscing about their childhood. So it couldn't have been the perfect tense, which requires 2 verbs, 2 forms. It had to be this one. Number 8, können wir endlich ein bisschen Ruhe haben? Can we finally have a little bit of quiet? Again, we've got a modal verb at the start of the sentence, which sends the verb all the way to the end of the sentence and in its infinitive form with an en. And notice that we're starting with a verb here because it's a question, and so we have to start with a verb or at least a question word, and that's why the verb is not in second position. Number 9, in den kommenden Ferien werde ich nichts zu tun haben. In this case, we're talking about a future time period in the coming holidays. And so we know that we need to use the future tense, or at least the present tense, talking about the future, but we've got 2 gaps. So we've got to have the future tense with werde. And what werde does is, well, similarly to a modal verb, it sends the next verb to the end of the sentence with an en and no zu. In the coming holidays, I won't have anything to do. Number 10, wer die Wahl hat, hat die Qual. Whoever has the choice has the torture or the agony. This is an idiom to refer to that agony of choice, that paralysis of choice when you've got so many options and it's hard to make a decision. And what's interesting grammatically about this sentence is that because we've got a question word in a non-question, then the conjugated verb goes to the end of the clause. And when we've got a conjugated verb at the end of a clause and then a comma, the next word must be the next conjugated verb. And sometimes we call this rule the verb, comma, verb rule, which is not creatively named, but helps us to remember the rule.